Then we'll move to the principal area and the ECRA visitors.
Come on up, gentlemen, while the seat's warm.
It got warmer, didn't it?
Good job, Chris.
Take care, yeah.
Good job.
Thank you for answering the
Thank
question.
you. I mean, I'm not frustrated at you, I'm frustrated with the seat coming off of
Chris, you want to do the introductions?
Sure. As we discussed at the last board meeting, we have ECRA representatives here tonight to answer your questions, to explain the scope of their work, and to identify how ECRA can move forward with you at the board level. So I'd like to invite Executive Vice President, or introduce Executive Vice President Steve Humphrey and President John Gatta.
Evening, and thanks again for having us, give us the time to be here. We want to try to get right to your specific questions, but I want to just give a little bit of a backdrop to the work in the district. And I think your district, your leadership team should be commended because not everyone's doing the work you're doing with data around student performance, around work in terms of looking ahead to the future and what that information is telling you, where your work could go, return on investment, pieces that are important to you from a standpoint of fiscal matters. So Kristen and Kevin have spent, and their teams have spent a lot of time going over the data. And a lot of reports that we've given during last year as requested by the team to try to answer questions. And so we feel like we've had an ongoing, really good rapport with your team about what they're looking for. Tonight we want to get to where we fell short in your expectations regarding those reports that you may have seen. It may have caused questions that you may have now. I would just point out that I've had a long history with the district, and during that time working with you, we've always tried to deliver high-quality services and high-quality programs for you to help with your particular challenges or your particular needs. And that's certainly what I believe ECRA tries to do as a company. Our agreements with our clients are pretty basic. They're a level above a handshake probably on purpose. Once we set the dollar amount, we typically then respond to the district with what they're trying to get done and work with teams, and we really don't make a lot of adjustments in those agreements. There hasn't been a need for that. So we've enjoyed those kinds of partnerships over the region and over the country where we've worked, and those have served us well and have served the districts well because people typically want more from us than is written in those contracts, and we comply with that. So that's a bit of a backdrop. We've enjoyed our relationship. With me tonight, Dr. John Gatta, president of ECRA Group. John's background, statistics, and teaching statistics to university level and doctorate level for the medical field. He is the architect of our models, has developed the models that have worked based on the last 50 years of research in the areas of growth, in the areas of statistics and probabilities and projections for school data. And in my mind, as a former practitioner, has really developed a way to help districts simplify the whole quagmire of data and kids, because you have a lot of data coming in about kids, different sources of data, and how do you quantify that into a fairly simple summary so that you can act on that. And that's where we find our value added is that we simplify so you're able to act. What's the score? Oh, Mike? I think it was 2-0 last I looked. Against the Cubs. Yeah.
I didn't have a score.
Oh, okay. So, so I think that we've tried to provide that value added to go where you want to go and to navigate that complex stream of data and student performance, which is difficult given all the data that schools have. So we've met with Kristen and Kevin's team and gone over the reports and how they're using our information, as well as projecting what they might do with the information that maybe they haven't used yet. So hopefully that'll be helpful as we go through this year. So Dr. Gatta's here tonight to try to, again, address specific questions you might have. Might be well to start with what questions are there that we should try to address?
Steve, if I can help set the table
Okay.
a little bit. We sent you 2 clips from the last 2 board meetings where
Right.
there were some general questions on, one, just the overall contract, and you came in and you did an analysis item by item with the administrative team, and then we also did that same analysis with Dr. Keene and Ms. Haruska, who serve on my Curriculum Advisory Council, where there seems to be some concerns with the model and some of the projections I know there was a board question on, one thing that came up big last spring was, under your model, John, the school district was performing at or better than suburban high schools with similar demographics and our size. And what the board, one of the things the board want to know is, well, who's in that model? Because in the board's eyes, they might not want to be compared to those schools. Or that might not be the schools that we want to see ourselves being compared to. We maybe want to set the bar higher. There were some problems with trying to get through that with your last consultant on who we're being compared to within the model. Then there was the overall, what does a suburban high school look like, the ECRA model. And just a general, a school of this demographics and this size should be performing at this level. So there was a little of, well, who says it, or how is that determined? Another question that came up just as early as last week, or last board meeting, was there were some comments, even when the projections that you came up with for our current seniors, Kristen and her team presented data for the current graduating class, and the ECRA prediction was higher than what those students performed at. And so there was a comment like even their projections were off. But I think there needs to be some gap filling of, well, here's your projection. If they go through this series of tests or classes, et cetera, they should be performing at this level. There's still the human factor and some of those things. So I think I need you to speak to that as well. And then I think there'll be a couple questions that will come from the board directly towards you, or get some answers. But those seem to be the ones that were fresh on, that it continued to come up in my dealings with the board.
Well, good. Well, thanks for providing the opportunity for me to come and address the board and certainly get all your questions answered. I'm in a position to answer. I can't imagine any question that you have I can answer. But I think it's important to take a step back and make sure that we understand sort of the questions that we're asking and what ECRA can or cannot provide. And part of my being here is to make sure that there's no ambiguity in what we are able to produce as a firm for you, depending on the questions that you're asking. And that has to do predominantly with available data, whether those questions can be answered or not. But let me structure the conversation just a little bit so that we can, and we're gonna answer specifically all these questions.
Okay.
So the first piece is when we talk about academic achievement in any global sense, the way the research environment has structured that conversation, the way that policy has structured that conversation, and the way the practitioners have structured that conversation, it's around two big ideas, right? It's about achievement status or achievement attainment. Where are your students at any point in time against benchmarks that are meaningful? And then academic growth. What is the progress that students are making over time from year to year? Those are two very different pieces, right? The benchmarks that are available to answer questions of how you're doing as it relates to status and as it relates to growth are very different. So we have to think about those pieces. And so when we think about either one of those, always this idea is, how are we doing relative to a benchmark, right? And so all of these questions that we're going to have tonight and all the way that I'm going to respond to it is really what's the question, and then what's the relevant benchmark. As it pertains to achievement status, that's just how well do your students compete against external standards, right? We're in a position that we can answer almost anything, and I think we've provided that. I mean, we've compared your district achievement profile to the state. We've compared it to models that take into account your characteristics. We've even compared it to specifically the districts that you've asked us to compare it to on the achievement status side of things. That's pretty easy. That's downhill because of the available data that exists. When we go to the achievement growth side of things, things get a little bit more complicated because there just really isn't much data available to answer specific questions of how does our growth compare to specific districts. That is a difficult question to answer. Now, how does your growth compare to the state? How does your growth compare to the nation? How does your growth compare to Chicago suburban land? Those are answerable questions. How does your growth compare to Stevenson? Or how does your growth compare to New Trier? those are difficult questions, if not impossible, to answer. And so I think that provides you some framework, at least to begin the questioning, so that we understand what we can provide, what we can't provide, but ultimately make some decisions here about what are the questions that you have as a board, and let's talk about what we can answer.
So are those impossible because you're not, there was some, you don't have some of those schools' data, or that's not data that's public? Why is that impossible to say Stevenson grew this much from their plan to the ACT, RB only grew this much?
Because there's no publicly available data to do that. And so separate from a policy standpoint, okay, if we were to, let's say hypothetically,
Let's say Stevenson was your client
Right.
and RB was your client.
right, hypothetically, if every single district that you wanted to compare your growth to, not the status, if you wanted to compare your growth to, and let's say they were a client, every single one of our clients, yes, theoretically then, could we provide that? Yes. There's two problems with that. Not every specific district that you want to compare yourselves are clients of ours, but the second, as a matter of policy, we wouldn't do it anyway, because we don't report data that isn't in the public domain on other districts. It's just something we don't do. We would never take as a.
Our growth is in the public domain. Maybe not the way it's reported to the state or something, but
We choose to
in our
release.
meetings 2 or 3 times a year, which means it's a matter of public record and it's available.
And if it's a matter of, if it's in the public record and available, then those kinds of things can be compared. But what we can't do is just go perform a specific analysis on a different client of ours for the sake of comparing you to them. That's just something that we don't do as a matter of policy. But what we do is develop benchmarks that get you, I think, ultimately where you want to be is, how does our growth compare to benchmarks that have certain definitions, whether those definitions are the state, whether those definitions are
Well,
the...
we didn't need to hire you to compare us to the state and to the, what other one, national, right? That's available on plenty of databases, what the average results are, right?
But we're talking about growth, mind you. The status
Yeah.
is easy.
Right.
The status is easy.
Right.
Growth, which we have a lot of different models that we can run your growth through, but they're not going to pinpoint a specific district.
The state doesn't report growth.
Not at the high
plan.
school.
No,
They do at the elementary,
but not the high school.
not at the high school.
Correct. So the
Should
one
we-
issue that came up when we were
should review
using,
the idea of growth in terms of what that represents, or do we?
we were using growth from plan all the way through ACT. The issue one issue, and so I think you're speaking to a little bit, was with the benchmarks, is that it would help the board understand how these benchmarks or this model is made, because what they're concerned about is if they're trying to push the administration to achieve at a higher level, and we're coming to them and saying, oh, the benchmarks are showing that we're doing good compared to these benchmarks. And so that's one of the questions that we spent a lot of time on last spring, and I think you're answering it a little bit, that your policy doesn't, but there was some concern of what schools are you using to make up the benchmark?
So let me, I think this will
Schools is one
help.
issue, but there's another issue. You gave us a bunch of variables and said these are issues that help growth, but you never gave us saying, is it the college readiness that an 8th grader comes in is the overwhelming primary issue that helps growth in the future, or is it demographics of the parents? You know, I came away based on that saying we should pick up the school and move it to a different demographic area based on all those variables you said, because all we got was this pool of data, and you never gave us a correlation and said this one's as strong, this is the number one factor based on our data pool that says this is the number one driver that drives growth in the school.
So there's a couple of different pieces here. So the model that you're speaking about the benchmark model of how you compare against districts that have similar characteristics as yours. We run into this issue with lots of school districts, right? And it has to do with the fact that the science of benchmarking has radically changed over the years. And just hear me out on this. What used to be done in the past, right, was this whole idea of match pairing. Let's go find people, or districts or organizations, whatever, you're looking at, let's go find districts that look like us and create sort of a peer group, right? And then compare ourselves to that peer group, right? That's been going on for a long, long time, right?
And when those kind of data is made available, you're an expert on stat. Have you ever done a report that didn't say who was in the population of who you're analyzing? Because that's really what we were asking for. Who's the peer you're comparing us to?
And the answer.
And it's a secret.
No, it doesn't exist, and let me explain why. No, this is the fundamental issue here, is when you create benchmark models, right, you take all the data that's available across the state, right, you use regression models, right, to say, given all of the variables that exist across the state, given the relationship between income and outcomes, given the relationship between housing values, ethnic distributions, all of these different characteristics that make up a community, right, all of that goes into a benchmark model, a statistical model, right, that leverages every piece of data across the state to say, this is how these variables combine to produce an expected achievement level, right? And so what we do is there's one model for the whole state of Illinois, and then we take your characteristics and we plug it into that model, and the model produces a benchmark that has the definition, given your characteristics, you should be performing at this level, and where are you actually performing? So I think the core of this issue is there is no peer group. The group is synthetically created by the statistical model. And so it's a regression analysis. It's a way of just regressing performance on characteristics using all of the state of Illinois, but the interpretation that comes out of those models is, are you performing relatively better or relatively worse?
So your handful has underperformers in it, have overperformers in it, and have midpoint performers in it, pulled together, and we're comparing to that. That's not what we want. We want to compare to those high achievers and use that as our model to go and how are we doing to the high performers. Give us the top 50 schools in the state. How do we compare against them? And where are the variables that are the key things that can make us better?
Before you answer that, could you just go back? Were you talking about status and growth just now, or just growth?
Just growth.
It tells us the benchmark of our growth to the growth of this pool.
Right, because the growth isn't available for the top 50 schools.
So, but go back on both of their points. You gave a long explanations. We take the data from all the schools in the state. But you don't have data from all the schools in the state on growth, right?
So,
Wait, hold on, Kristen. Do you have data from all the schools in the state, high schools on growth?
No. That comment was related to the specific benchmark model that was provided to the board that dealt with adjusted status.
So if I could interject, what Tim is asking, so in the adjusted status report, we had two pieces of information. We had the ECRA benchmark, which you just described, and then we had a suburban sample. And so the board was originally asking for the list of schools that comprise that suburban sample. And so you explained where all of the data came from the ECRA benchmark, but their question is still whether or not we could have the list of schools from the suburban sample.
Which we did provide as a follow-up analysis for the status piece. That was provided. We did an additional analysis of how your achievement status compares to the exact districts that you wanted. That was provided.
Right, but that was off of stuff that's just on the public school report card.
Right, that's right. There's nothing.
So what Kristen's saying, there was a suburban sample.
So and when we had in the adjusted status report for each area for the ACT scores, we had a suburban sample that I believe was some representation of some of your clients that showed how much growth that suburban sample had. And we received some characteristics of that suburban sample in terms of their average ACT score, some of their demographics, but the board is still requesting a list of those schools that comprised of your suburban sample.
We would say, people would say, you don't have to tell us the score of anybody. We said, for this measure, what schools are we being compared? For this measure, what schools are we going to compare it to? You didn't have to say, Hinsdale Central's is, 23 ACT or 26 or whatever they have. We just want to know, instead of this esoteric, we have great analysis here, how do we project that to the public if, say, well, we have this analysis, we have no idea who we're being compared to, but we're being told we're better than everybody. It just, it doesn't have any meat on the bone in my mind then.
Well, so let me answer that directly, and then let's, maybe focusing on the questions that you really want us to answer, and we'll just talk about what is or isn't possible. But I want to go back to, I can't tell you who's, even analytically, I can't tell you who's exactly in there, because the way benchmark models are developed is you take samples of students all over, you use characteristics, and you come up with estimates to the best of that the science can about what is typical for Chicago suburban land or what is typical for certain definitions. So there isn't a basket of districts. That's, I think, the most important piece to understand here is, once you transition.
That's the old way it was done, it was finding the peer group, and now you're saying you can't
That's
do that.
kind of well, you can, it's just an older methodology to create specific
Your
districts.
model does not do peer groups. It's a
No,
benchmark.
we
Well,
use
it does the
statistical
status.
models to do that work for us, right? And
Well,
so,
again, for a PhD, that might make sense. For old people like me, learned it a different way and have to explain it to my neighbor, saying, well, they've done a wonderful analysis, no idea who's included in it, but they're telling us we're doing good or we're doing bad. It doesn't translate.
so let's talk about the questions that the board really wants answered, and I can speak to what we're in a position to provide or what we would not be in a position to
Well,
provide.
I wouldn't mind you just keep going. You were discussing how you're developing this thing, because I'm sorry we interrupted, but
Right.
if you're telling me, you're explaining what your model's based on, that's what I want to know, and then we can sort of infer
So
what
when-
you can or can't do.
So when we build these models, we go through a research process, right? We go through a research process to say, right, given the available data, can we build statistical models? And what those are regression models. For those of you that basically have an outcome variable, the variable that we ultimately want to make statements about, whether that be growth, whether that be status, whether that be reading, whether that be math, right? And then we regress that on a set of variables that are going to help us set targets, right? And so we can use that basic framework then to develop models that have different kinds of definitions to them, right? We can come up with models that are adjusted status based on exactly your characteristics. We can come up with models that have the definition of Chicago suburban land. We can come up with models that have the definition of the nation, models that have the definition of the state. But it isn't as tangible as just creating a group of districts that we compare against. Now, in follow-up, we can do that. We did it for status, right? It's a,
Status was the ACT score, not growth, so they
right,
understand.
just the ACT score.
But that's publicly available for every school, high school in the state, right?
Right, so there's not.
Every
it's not-
public high school.
Right. So other than legwork, you could have done that
Okay.
yourself, right?
So
You can go up
compare,
and.
so how many high schools are in Illinois?
360.
There's 360, so we know on the status, we were compared to everybody. But on the growth, it's only people that you have the data on, right?
But,
Because you said it's not, you can only go it, so it's publicly
but so
available.
long as there's enough data to be representative, right? I mean, the whole science of benchmarking and the whole science of estimation is built on this idea that we don't need everybody.
I understand
But if
that.
we have enough representative samples, we can use models to fill in the gaps and create
Okay,
benchmarks
let's-
that are meaningful.
Again, let's bring it down. There's 366 high schools in the state. For the status, did you use all of them, or some of them, or part of them, or what did you use to compare us for status? Because that
Every
information,
single, well,
that information is publicly available on all the schools, the ACT.
right, the relationship between your scores against your characteristics is not. That's what we
Right.
provided, the model.
So the status report you did, we gave you the specific 10 schools, or the 12 schools. We took, Kristen and I went into
Right.
the status, and we said, here are the, off the Chicago Tribune, or, we said, here are the top 10 public high schools. And so that's what they just
And we
basically
provided
took
that
all
as
the
a follow-up.
data and broke that down for us.
That was the follow-up analysis.
Right.
The
Yeah,
first analysis
Original one you did,
was the model.
and would that have included all 366 high schools in the state?
The model was
In your modeling?
trained on all high schools in the state.
Okay,
And then you guys were run through the model.
okay. On growth, because you said the information is not publicly available, like how many high schools were included in the growth model? You said you did the state and you did the suburb, you had to have some idea how many were in the state and how many were in the suburban for that comparison.
We take samples of students from our data warehouse, and then we calibrate
I
the model.
understand that. Is it a secret to tell me about how many in the state and how many in the suburban? Are in your model?
We're in our actual growth,
Yeah.
the model that we use to train our growth model.
Yeah.
I would have to look that up. I don't even know that off the top of my head.
But is that an answer you can say, hey, it's roughly 100 schools out of the 360, or?
We're more concerned with the representation of the students than we are the districts, is more the approach that we take. But certainly we could track that back to say, are there 40, 50, 60, 100
Schools.
schools, right? But we're not going to take all the students from the schools. See what I mean? We're going to take samples from lots of different schools so that we can develop something that better reflects the suburbs, as opposed to just saying we're going to take these 5 schools. And I think that's,
That's where you're losing us.
well,
I understand that it's probably a well-thought-out model. Probably Laura's okay with it, because this is what she and John might be. But that's what I need them to get. We got to figure out a way to bridge so they understand when we give them a report.
And I
This
think-
is just truly a projection. This is truly just an estimation.
And let's simplify it to this too. Kristen keeps telling us, and I think we all trust her very much, that the individual analysis data you have is great. And I'm not challenging that. But when people are paying their taxes or decide to move into this neighborhood, they're looking at what our scores are against Hinsdale and Lyons Township and Oak Park River Forest and whatever other schools you want to pick. And having this wonderful statistical analysis that just compares us to a few kids at every school, which we don't even know who they are, to say we're doing better or worse, that doesn't really help us showing whether we're going to grow, whether we're growing properly.
Can you tell me why the state doesn't require the high schools to have the growth data, but the elementary schools do?
federal regulations,
Federal?
federal.
But why?
Well, it's not that they can't, they're not required to.
So if you had this growth data, you could do the same thing you did for status, for its growth, and then we'd get a percentage of how, for say, percentage growth, you could rank us in terms of the percentage of high schools in the state in terms of our growth. You could do that?
Sure.
Could you do it now just based on what you have?
No, you'd have to have permission from every district.
We can do it against the definition of how you compare against the state, how you compare against the nation, how you compare against Chicago suburban land. We can't do it against a finite and specific set of districts.
But does having the data that says we're in the top 20% of growth in suburban land, you can tell us that?
I think we told you similar
You did
kinds of
tell us
things,
that.
yeah. I mean, I don't know if it was 20%, whatever it was, we provided that analysis.
The sticking point was, back in the spring was, well, who are we being compared to? Because like Gary mentioned earlier, he wants to only be compared to the top 50 schools in Illinois. But if you don't have those top 50 schools in a peer group that you have their growth data, you can't do that.
Here's my frustration, all right? Not only do I want the starting point, says this is how we're doing right now compared to, a more refined focus, but what inputs and what can we do differently to get us even higher? And that, I got no picture from that at all, because if you go look at our 25-year history of ACT scores, flat, no growth.
Well, that's a different question. We can consult with you on that question. That's a question, just a very different question.
So the issue is, we can say, yeah, we're doing something here, we're patting ourselves on the back and saying, oh yeah, we show growth that's greater than what ACT says you should be doing, but you go look at 25 years history of ACT scores, 22, 23, 22, 23, 22, 23, 22, 23, no growth. And so we're doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. We need to get that. So what are the key elements of the input stream that way bigger to get that growth factor up higher? All I saw were a bunch of things: demographics, background,
I can
college
tell you-
readiness. Out of your model, is there?
What can we focus on?
What, yeah, what out of your model? What are the stronger elements that correlate better to getting those ACTs up to 28?
Without doing a deep dive in a curriculum audit and instructional pieces, but I can give you, the research is very well established on this, right? There are a few things that you can really focus on that just are universal truths as it relates to public education or any education, that I think can be considered fact for the sake of planning, and if you focus on, will make a difference, right? And so certainly one of them is rigor matters, right? And so I think that's been documented over and over and over again. The more rigorous you make your programming, the more rigorous exposure that students have to courses. That's why you see such emphasis on advanced placement and moving kids into advanced
So we
placement.
did that.
It's
For the
part,
last
it's part of
10
a
years,
larger.
We've had strong AP courses, 22, 23, 22, 23, 22, 23. Okay, next one.
Rigor, what's next?
Rigor. Focus matters as an organization, right? Being steadfastly focused on a vertically articulated scope and sequence and curriculum and course structures that build off of each other is going to matter. Quality of teaching, research over and over and over and over confirms that, probably the single best impact that you can have on student outcomes is to continue to develop your teachers, right? I mean, those are the ones that are providing the instruction in the classroom, and over and over and over. The more you focus on developing teachers, and the more you focus on improving the actual quality of instruction going on in the classroom, it's going to pay incredible dividends, right?
So for us, is some of the problem because we haven't captured a baseline measure for some of those areas?
We're drifting into an area that I can't speak definitively of what you have done or haven't done or what we've provided, right?
Well, you've
But-
done
but
2 or 3
certainly-
program evaluations.
Right.
And so what we've started to do with the data you provided in those program evaluations is we started to show that kids that have taken our sophomore reading class have not grown as much as you've projected. And so Kristen's now going back and working with our assistant principal of curriculum instruction and the reading teachers to say, well, we're putting all these kids in the sophomore reading because that's supposed to help them grow on their ACT. They're not showing the growth. So we are starting to do a dive into what you're giving us and then going back and looking at the teachers, the rigor, the focus.
The
That's what we're
analysis
starting
that-
to do.
right, and the analysis that I would recommend that you do, given the tools you have available through us, and we can help fill in the gaps if you don't have it directly available to you, is I would study, because you have the growth framework, right? And you have this idea of making individual projections for students, right? And how they're progressing through your students. I would study the course sequences that students take. How do students matriculate through your system, and how do certain sequences yield accelerated growths versus other? You will find, we find it universally, there are cohorts of kids that go through your, I'm saying this without knowing this, but knowing our experience in other places. You will find that you have cohorts of kids that start off taking the same course. Some go one way, some go the other way in their choice of subsequent courses. One direction may provide better growth than the other direction. And so identifying what are the course sequences that actually produce accelerated growth is a really meaningful thing to do, because then you can help guide students to make sure that they don't veer off more rigorous paths, and they make sure that they're getting exposed to the content that ultimately is going to make the difference on ACT or now SAT.
How much weight is based on maybe you don't have a model this way, on college readiness for the 8th grader coming in, on the impact of how much growth they have in a high school?
So part of that argument is the motivation for growth in and of itself, right? Is this idea that we have to know where students are when they enter us if we're going to serve them appropriately. And so a lot, once you dive into this, what you're going to find is that the name of the game is placing students correctly the first day of 9th grade. That is because high schools, by the nature of the way the courses build on each other and the nature of how departments and course offerings are structured, if you don't get that placement right for the student entering in 9th grade, it's going to be really hard to get them back off a track if it's not the track that you want them on, right? So the point being is understanding your course sequences and which ones lead to higher growth rates than others, understanding which course sequences leads to more exposure to rigorous courses in AP, and then backtracking that back to what courses do you have to start ninth grade with, and then making sure that your placement protocols for how students get appropriately placed into incoming freshman courses, that's one of the things that you could do to begin to make sure that students are
But I also, there's another key component right here. One of the reports that you generated show that 1 out of 3 kids coming into this high school are below that 16 score. And if you're below that 16 score, to make it to that 21 is very hard to do. And what we need to be able to do as a partner with the feeder schools, be able to get those kids moving up and getting that ratio even less, to be able to have them hit that 16 score. So directionally, we need to be able to work with the feeder saying, here's where we're seeing the weakness at. Here's what you need to do to get your curriculums better. Would you agree, Kristen, on that?
As having studied this in all over the nation, I can tell you it's 6th grade. All this starts in 6th grade.
So I think that's Gary's biggest question, is there's been a push from the board, and I think that goes to your focus, which aligns to your vertical articulation. We're starting to try to work with our feeder school districts so that we're impacting them more than when we get them at 9th graders, trying to get down and have an impact on what's going on at 6th, 7th, and 8th. We have not fully implemented that process yet. We're first working on that.
Because the tracking starts in 6th grade for most districts.
You're saying rigor's important,
Rigor is very important.
and if the rigor at the feeder schools doesn't start in 6th grade, but to Gary's point, the goal is to have every kid college ready. And we're asking the question, if groups of kids are coming in below the 8th grade college ready, can you develop the growth to get those children to be
And that
college
goes
ready
back
as a
to
senior?
Your dependent variables are, is it this 8th grade readiness? And then can you compare our school to a comparable school that has the same kind of readiness and has shown amazing growth? And and then we can identify, hey, what are they doing within their school to?
And that was our concern, because my concern, I'll speak for it. You basically kind of, and we appreciate it, to be honest, I mean, this history, all the research shows, here's 5 measures that affect it. You don't need a statistical analysis on any of those to know what they are. But like Gary said, if we know schools that either they're just high performing, like a Hinsdale Central, which we know that already, we can go talk to them, or we know there's other districts where their kids aren't coming college ready, but they're growing them a lot as a high school. It seems like our administration talk to them and say, what do you, help us, what do you do to have kids grow at a greater rate? Because, we may be able to adopt some of those ideas too, right?
Yeah, and that's a role that we could help you play too, connecting you to other districts as well.
But John, so that it doesn't get misinterpreted, Gary's question, we've got to nip this right now, because he's still asking the same question he asked 20 minutes ago. You cannot provide us other schools' growth 8th grade readiness data because it's not available. That's not public data.
It's not reported to the state. It could be publicly available by looking at their
The
website.
grammar school there, all that is available. The high school, they're not growth track.
Are we talking about status, or are we talking about growth?
Growth. Status, so that's all, yeah, growth. So there's nothing that says District 96 growth on college readiness exams like the plan is available to the public, that you could pull that and do an
We
analysis.
could do an analysis making certain kinds of assumptions. You're gonna have to make some
Assumptions,
assumptions.
but you couldn't
Assumptions,
go-
you're gonna have to, in the absence of data, you gotta make some assumptions to round out
Right, but to
the.
make this simple, I think they need to, there is no 8th grade readiness data available for you right now. And that was why, other than the
what's captured on
ISAT, that
Park,
was,
Other than what's captured on Park and
Correct.
what was captured on ISAT, correct.
so that's where I think they're mixing the two worlds up. So when he just asked you, can you take 8th grade readiness data from other comparable schools? There is no 8th grade readiness data. You'd have to either making assumptions of other schools you represent.
Well, I just want to be clear on this too. When you say 8th grade readiness, that's a status question. That you can answer. The effect that happens between 8th and 11th grade or 8th and 12th grade, the growth
That's what
that
we have
happens.
control over.
The growth.
What if the variable is readiness coming into high school is is weighed 70%, rigor is 20%, then I want to focus on the 70 and see, compare ourselves to the comparable model of who's coming in, and we got a comparable schools with the same level coming in, yet those schools shooting up to ACTs of 28 and ours are staying at 23. What are they doing differently in that growth factor that we can mirror? That's what, I want to take the data to change, not to just benchmark where we're at. So that's what I'm trying to get at, is if we can compare ourselves to, if college readiness coming in at 8th grade, or readiness coming in at 8th grade is a key variable, that's the correct.
It's not a key variable.
But then why does ACT use it to say that don't expect a hell of a lot of growth if they're coming in at this level versus coming in at 70%? Your growth's gonna be a hell of a lot better if they're coming in a hell of a lot more ready. That's what we were told.
A student that achieves a 16 or better on the plan has a better chance of achieving a 21 on the ACT in their junior year, correct?
Sure, if you come in higher, you have a higher probability of ending higher.
Correct.
Sure.
So what he's trying to mingle together is that if there was a way for us to get 8th grade, other schools, why are other schools preparing? A lot of that's gonna come back to
So
demographics.
If there's a comparable school that says 50% of them are coming in at 15, you know, and we're coming at 50%, 15, yet we grow 5 points to get to 2021. You can, same schools, 15, they get to grow 7, 8, and they're coming in averaging, 23, 24, 25. They're doing better than us.
But we don't know how much other high schools are growing, right? We can't know that.
In his data of his selected people, he doesn't have to tell us who, he does have that information.
He has assumptions. He has pockets.
The only thing we can't provide you is how your growth compares to specific districts. Because even
That's
if
what
we,
he's asking
but
for.
even if
You
they're
just summed it.
clients, they're probably not giving the same assessment schedule. They're giving tests at different times. There's no standardization of assessment at the high school level that
It's-
allows for these types of comparisons. It's just, it doesn't exist. You can't do it.
You just
And
answered a
so-
question. That's
And
what I
so
was
it's
trying
an
to get.
unanswerable question. Now, what you can do, though, again, is do it against
Benchmark.
benchmarks. You can do that.
But that's not what they were asking. You just answered a question.
So you talked about sequences. Do your tools provide our staff with whatever they need to identify sequences that produce higher growth?
Yeah. Yeah, we could work with your administration on that for sure.
Are we doing that now?
I don't think you've gotten it yet.
We haven't gotten there yet. So it may
But
be
you
that
could.
within our
You could.
own school, some of our students are growing quite a bit on one particular sequence compared to other students. But
Absolutely.
because we average everything together, it's progression towards the mean, and we're not seeing that.
But they have the ability to be very granular, all the way down to the individual student, or certain characteristics, or certain course sequences, to identify what paths are accelerating growth and what paths aren't.
That's what we're starting to dig into at the building level.
So would it behoove us then if we started to look at certain sequences and see what kind of growth we can get with those sequences?
Absolutely. Yeah, that would be a very effective thing to do.
Let me just ask one, and I know this has been very helpful, I must say, for me personally, and Ed had a go, but he said the same thing. Fundamentally, at the end of, let's say 3 years from now, we have all this good data, you're comparing students, you do your matrix, and we're 22, 23, 22, 23, 22, 23, or 5 years from now. Then how do we turn around and justify that we just spent $175,000 on all this analysis and we haven't done anything on our growth? Because I feel like you're giving this to us as like a scientist, which you are, a professor, that I can do this analysis and I can tell you all these things, but at the end of the day, as a board, when we're being told, hire more teachers, have smaller classes, do this, and we're willing to spend the money to do it, well, to spend our taxpayers' money to do it, and at 5 years from now, if we haven't improved our growth and improved our ACT, then I feel like it was an experiment that was futile, and we just spent a lot of money and got nothing for it.
I think that's a good point. But at the same token, so that, some of that we covered with Dr. Keene and with Ms. Haruska. So you broke down the data of how all those kids are doing in individual classes, and you're giving us the program evaluation. What we're starting to put in is go into the rigor, the focus, the development. So there's only so much they're gonna give us the data, and it's how much we're doing here. It is somewhat of a science, so now we're gonna try to tweak our sophomore reading curriculum. In 3 years, we might find out changing a teacher or possibly changing the software we're using or the textbook we used in that sophomore reading class still didn't make improvements. Because there's some human factor, if there was a cookie
Well,
cutter, I don't know if we can.
Somebody have it say the other side? It's always, be prepared for it not to improve. Can somebody say, we got confidence that if we do this, there's going to be improvement? I feel like whenever we have these presentations is, be prepared, it's a great idea, I'm glad you're trying it, you're spending money, that's good, but if it doesn't work, there's a human factor. I mean, if somebody could just give me some confidence, hey, I have a high degree of confidence because of what my knowledge is in the analysis that if you do this and make these improvements, we're saying, you're going to see growth. But all I keep hearing is, be prepared that it really might not make a difference.
If I could just make a few comments, I think it's important. Our role, at least as it relates up to this point, in the district and our relationship, our role has been to provide you information to let you know if what you're doing is working. Our role has not at all been until this point to tell you what to do, to tell you what to work on. We haven't really been involved in the instructional side at all.
Correct.
Of our relationship. The only thing that our relationship is focused on is providing you information and data to judge whether the changes that you are making are actually manifesting in improved outcomes. If what you're asking is you want us to be more involved in guiding the actual changes in the instruction, that's just a different kind of engagement. Those are the kinds of engagements we normally don't get involved in. We're
I'm
more
not
on the
asking
measurement
that.
side.
I'm asking you to tell us, based on the analysis you're giving us, if Kristen and Dr. Skinkus follow what you're saying, you're going to see improvement.
And what I'm saying is we've never provided those kinds of recommendations. We've never,
And you're-
ever
but
given those
you're
kinds.
comparing what we're currently doing against this broad pool, benchmarking against this broad pool of the weighted down low performers, mid performers, high performers, right? As opposed to where we want to focus in on.
But the way to, in closing, make this statement, the way to judge the effectiveness of the changes that you're making, the way to judge whether or not you are continuously improving this school district, the way to judge whether Sally is better off this year than she was last year, that Johnny's better off this year than he was last year, is not to do that against external benchmarks. The best way to do that is through the localized, personalized growth frameworks that we've provided to the district and to the administration to provide for each and every student a benchmark for what their past and what similar students in the past have grown in the district. Then as you make changes, right, you could actually assess whether there's been an incremental gain above where you were last year. Continuous quality improvement. You want to make sure that students' growth this year is a little bit better than last year. The following year, a little bit better than the next year.
But don't you want to benchmark against some external side?
100%, but that's not.
What's that benchmark where you currently gave them? The
What I-
weighted down pool of the state average.
He's not getting-
All I'm trying to convey is that external benchmarking is not going to answer the question
Oh,
whether
no,
these
no,
changes were
I
effective.
agree, and that's why we said, create a benchmark, and we can compare, but we also want to compare against the high performers. And as an external, saying, this is the arrow here for the external performers that are high performers. We're currently here, we're moving up, but we're not there yet.
We can provide you a benchmark. We can do this because we have the model. We can provide you an assessment of growth, right, that existed at your, within the district of how your growth compares to high-performing Chicago suburban districts. We can do that. But we can't go any more narrow than that, right?
It's
We
not gonna help
can't,
Kristen or I with our work, would it?
it's not gonna help you guys at all.
I'm trying
But
to-
from a
that's what-
governance standpoint, from a return on investment standpoint, I think that's what you're after. How does your growth
But doesn't.
compare
is
to?
that- doesn't, isn't it a goal?
Absolutely.
Can you use that as a goal?
One's a short-term goal, one's a long-term
Right.
goal. The long-term
I'm
goal
not
is,
sa- I'm not saying that the comparison internally within the district, you can see that, yeah, Suzie grew 5 points. Now we implemented something, and 3 years down the road, we're seeing that same demographic, same person, now grew 7.
Well, I think
I'm
it's-
all for that, but but from an external standpoint, high performers, they always get to 10. So we still got some areas to go. We still got to get there. We shouldn't be happy with 7. That's what I'm saying.
No, you're absolutely right. One's an external question of how do we compete, very important. That gets at the really big conversations of return on investment of the community. But then the other piece is a local question, are the changes that we're making showing
I understand
improvements?
that totally.
Well, you
So,
got to why we're here and spent all this time. Again, we have confidence. Kristen tells us the second piece on the local, individual student, quite happy with it. Now you're saying you can do a comparison to high-performing
we can create a
schools
benchmark, but I can't
on
say
here,
that
and
it's these
that
specific
we
districts.
think is important to the board to be able to see a high-level overall result we're having.
We can definitely tell you, here's how your growth compares to high-performing Chicagoland suburban districts, and here's how we define high-performing Chicagoland districts. We're gonna have to define that by giving you the profile of their ACT scores.
Okay.
But
See
you're
what I'm
not going to
saying?
say a specific school.
No, we're not gonna be able to say it's Stevenson, or it's Hinsdale, but we can say the people in this sample have an average ACT score of 28, right? And here's how they grew. That we can do.
Okay,
That we
now,
can do.
Let me say something here. Okay, so what you're telling me, I think, is that you basically have our high school sample, our students, the best measure is historical performance. In other words, we're making a change now. We compared what RB did, whatever, several years ago versus what we're doing after we make the change. Is that right? That's the best. Well, actually, that's the best because the other schools have all the many more variables that you can't control for.
Right, exactly.
Right. So you can do
That's
that for
exactly
us.
You can't
Okay,
control
so,
two parents that went to college versus one parent or no college. You
right,
can't-
so now I get what you, I understand what you're saying here. Now, you made the comment before about what we have to concentrate on is what we can change, right? We want to get better. So you made some comment about how we're placing kids. I mean, are we doing that right now? Can you tell us that? Are we placing the kids right?
We haven't been
We'd
part
have
of
to
those
do-
You haven't been
conversations.
part of that, so it's something that maybe
Right.
you can do.
So we do that a lot, helping districts create.
Okay, well, we have to understand if we're going to hire you to do something, what
So John.
what we're doing. Now, the other issue, let me finish this, Kevin, it goes along those paths. You're saying that the sixth grade is when the placement starts in sixth grade. So if our feeder districts aren't doing the right job, are we permanently stunting the kids by the time they get here? Can you say that scientifically?
What I'm saying is that's where the tracking starts. And yes, if,
If you incorrectly track them in sixth grade, they're going to come here, and that's going to affect their growth in the future.
without intervention, if you don't like the track they're on, yes, you're gonna, the feeders or summers, yes, you're gonna have to do something different.
So you just say keyword, intervention, so that the board understands. We ranked our priorities of what we wanted them to evaluate. This Board of Education, since my tenure here, spent a lot of money on plan. We dedicated full-time teachers to teach just our plan class. So they did a program evaluation on plan, if I'm not mistaken, or we were gonna do it, so that we can see this intervention, taking these kids that are coming, if we put them in plan, over 3 years or 4 years, did they grow the way we were supposed to? If not, we're wasting money on plan, we should take that money and invest it in another. So we did plan, we did reading courses, because that's where this board has spent their most money publicly, on Read 180, reading teachers, reading interventionists, plan. So that's what we've had them do program analysis of and start giving us that data on.
That's great. And he hit it right. There's 2 levels of data. We've got a lot of confidence, and maybe there's some more things you can do on this. And, okay, if you can tell us high performance and can't tell us who we're doing, that's a lot better than what we think we got before.
We can
So,
definitely
and
do that.
that,
Okay.
that gives us the ability to compare over time how our school, our district and our school is comparing against other high-performing schools. And if we're doing it right, the analysis at the low level is gonna, in totality, have us improve as a district against them, right? And then everybody's happy.
Right.
Kid,
Can we try to bring it to a
Yeah,
conclusion
I
as
just
best as
have-
possible?
so when we are looking at our scores, might it be beneficial for us if we look at quartiles of our student body? Because my fear is that when we take an average, we're regressing everything towards a mean. I think probably our top 50% are growing at a much higher rate than we realize compared to maybe our lower quartile or, that second quartile. If we were to look at the growths in the different quartiles, we might see that portions of our district are growing like we had hoped. But when we lump everybody together, we keep saying we're getting 22, 23, 22, 23. Well, because we're lumping everything together.
At the administration level, through the tools that we provide you, that's all happening. Because you can drill, you can isolate to different parts of the distribution and see how the low kids are growing and the middle kid and the high kids. So all of that's happening.
So we probably should report some of that out, because when we look at an SAT, we're lumping everybody together. But if we were to look at our school, if our school was only the students in the 25 percentile, we might compare with some of those more aggressive schools. Or if we were to look at our population as the top 50%, maybe helping us walk through that, because there are certain characteristics that we can't control on student growth, like priorities in the home, family background. Maybe not everybody in
It
this
goes
neighborhood
back-
wants to
it
grow
goes
as much.
Back to my question of
Yes.
the variables coming in, if you weighed them the greatest, what is the, prioritize them? Is it the college readiness coming in 8th grade? Is it the demographics? Is it the income level? What are those variables? Then we can see that compared to our district and say, okay, we're handicapped.
Okay.
Well,
That's that's why I asked the question, how do you weigh those variables? Which one has more correlation?
right, but the
Which one's 99 correlation to 8 growth?
But some of that
I
is
can-
just gonna be typical demographic data.
I can close with this comment,
And we'll close with this comment.
that the answer to improving this district is not to change the characteristics of the community.
That's a good comment. I
That's a
like
good,
that.
That's a good comment.
Yeah, we agree with
And I
that.
can tell you that the most immediate impact you're going to have on growth, not status is confounded with all kinds of things. We're talking about growth. It's everything you do day in and day out when these students are here, and the programs that you put into place as a district is how you're going to accelerate growth.
okay.
And you just your models have to be sensitive enough to be making the adjustments for everything else.
So when you projected the senior class that graduated should have been at 22-something, now we're going back through with Kristen and her team, looking at the data, well, why didn't those kids hit that benchmark? Because every other senior that took this sequence of course or this intervention came out close to being at that number you gave us.
And those projections.
So then
already
she takes
factor
that
in
with
all
her
that.
team and says, why didn't we hit that target? And that's where we're working backwards. So we're using this, we'll start sharing some of that data in future, John, with you and Kristen and the board, but I think that helped tonight, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you
for
very
coming
much.
out.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
It was a good
Thank you,
discussion.
Good job, Steve.
We're gonna get you some data
I
that,
tried to hang in.
we're
there.
gonna,
Check the scores again.
we're gonna get you some comparative growth data that you're gonna be happy with.
Okay. Moving on.